Majuba Hill, Transvaal, South Africa. February 27th, 1881. 3:30 in the morning. 405 British soldiers are climbing a mountain in the dark. They are silent, sweating through wool tunics in the hivelled cold, boots sliding on loose shale. At their head walks Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley, one of the most decorated staff officers in the British Army, a man fluent in 4 languages, a graduate of the Staff College at the top of his class. Below them, unseen in a laager of ox wagons and canvas tents, sleep the men Colley has come to humiliate, a scattering of Boer farmers, part-time soldiers, men who will be milking cows again by summer. By dawn, Colley believes, this war will effectively be over. He is climbing toward the worst defeat of his career. He will not survive to regret it. So how does the most professional army on earth lose to a militia of farmers who'd never worn a uniform in their lives? And how did that single morning on a hilltop in South Africa help set the stage for an empire's undoing? To understand what happened on Majuba, you have to go back 3 years, to a piece of paper signed in Pretoria that nobody in London thought would matter very much. In April 1877, a British special commissioner named Theophilus Shepstone rode into the capital of the South African Republic, the Transvaal, with 25 mounted police and a proclamation. The Transvaal, a Boer republic founded by descendants of Dutch, French Huguenot, and German settlers who'd trekked north decades earlier to escape British rule at the Cape, was bankrupt, threatened by the PD and Zulu kingdoms on its borders, and politically paralyzed. Shepstone annexed it for the British Crown without firing a shot. London barely noticed. The Transvaal Boers noticed everything. For 3 years they petitioned, protested, and sent delegations to London that were politely ignored. Then, in December 1880, they stopped petitioning. At a mass meeting at Paardekraal, thousands of armed Boer farmers declared their republic restored and their government reinstated under a triumvirate led by Paul Kruger. Within days they had wiped out a British column at Bronkhorstspruit, killed and wounded over half its strength, and besieged the small British garrisons scattered across the Transvaal. This was not supposed to be a real war. The British Empire in 1881 controlled a quarter of the globe. It had just finished, at enormous cost, crushing the Zulu kingdom at Ulundi. It had modern rifles, artillery, discipline, and 2 centuries of institutional confidence. Its opponents this time were farmers. Men who fought part-time, elected their own officers, and went home for the harvest if nobody stopped them. That confidence is the story. George Pomeroy Colley was, on paper, exactly the man to end this embarrassment quickly. Born in Dublin in 1835 into an Anglo-Irish family with more prestige than money, he'd commissioned into the second foot at 17 and spent the next 2 decades building a reputation as the brightest staff mind in the British Army, a favorite of Lord Wolseley, a veteran of China and the Second Anglo-Ashanti War, a man who had passed the Staff College entrance exam so far ahead of the field that examiners reportedly checked for cheating. He was, by every account, brilliant. He was also, by 1881, High Commissioner for Southeast Africa and General Officer Commanding, a man who had climbed extraordinarily fast and who had never, in his entire career, lost a battle. That is the formative fact to hold on to. Colley had never lost. And a man who has never lost has never had to seriously imagine losing. Facing him were men built from entirely different material. Commandant General Piet Joubert, a wiry, cautious 50-year-old lawyer farmer with a grey beard and a reputation for defensive patience, commanded the Boer forces besieging the British at Laing's Nek. Beneath him, a younger, more aggressive field cornet named Nicolaes Smit, a farmer in his 30s, quiet, deliberate, respected by the men under him not because he outranked them but because they'd voted him into command. The Boer commandos had no barracks, no drill sergeants, no parade ground discipline. What they had was a lifetime spent on horseback with a rifle, hunting game and fighting on the frontier since childhood. Marksmanship, to a Transvaal Boer, wasn't a military skill. It was how you ate. By late February 1881, Colley had already been stopped twice, once at Laing's Nek in January, where a frontal assault against entrenched Boer riflemen had been bloodily repulsed, and again at the Ingo River, where his column had been pinned down for hours by accurate long-range fire. Twice, professional infantry advancing in the open had been shot to pieces by farmers lying prone in the grass. A cautious commander draws one lesson from 2 defeats. Colley drew another. He decided the answer was to go over the Boers' heads, literally. Majuba Hill, Zulu for Hill of the Doves, rose nearly 2,000 feet above the Boer camp at Laing's Nek, its flat summit commanding the entire position below. If British guns and riflemen held that summit, Colley reasoned. The Boer would be untenable, exposed to plunging fire from directly above. The Boers would have to retreat or be destroyed. It was, on a map, an elegant idea. Seize the high ground, win the war from above, and do it so quietly and so quickly that by the time the enemy realized what had happened, it would already be over. He never seriously considered that Boer farmers, men who had spent their entire lives reading terrain, judging distance, and climbing exactly this kind of country on foot and horseback, might be very, very good at retaking a hill. The march began at 10 p.m. on the 26th of February. Roughly 405 men, detachments of the 58th Rutlandshire Regiment, the 92nd Gordon Highlanders, the 60th King's Royal Rifle Corps, and a party of sailors from the Naval Brigade hauling a single Gatling gun partway before abandoning it as impractical, filed out of the British camp at Mount Prospect in near total darkness. No lights. Minimal talking. They climbed for 5 hours over broken, rocky ground, several men falling from exhaustion, canteens running dry in the cold. By around 3:45 a.m., the leading companies reached the summit. It was, as Colley had guessed, essentially undefended, a wide, saucer-shaped plateau roughly the size of several football pitches, ringed by a rocky rim, overlooking the entire Boer position at Lang's Neck nearly 2,000 feet below. Colley reportedly looked down at the sleeping Boer, its cook fires just beginning to glow in the pre-dawn dark, and said something to the effect that the Boers would get a great surprise when daylight came. They did. It just wasn't the surprise he meant. Here is where you need to pay attention, because what happens over the next few hours explains everything that follows, and it comes down almost entirely to two very different definitions of what holding a hill means. If you're new to this channel and you like these deep, blow-by-blow breakdowns of the battle's history skims past, this is a good moment to subscribe, because we're about to spend the next 15 minutes inside one of the most avoidable disasters in the history of the British Army, and it only gets more granular from here. Dawn broke around 4:30 a.m. down in the Boer camp. Sentries began shouting. British troops were visible on the crest of Majaba, silhouetted against the brightening sky, some of them reportedly cheering and waving their helmets at the Boers below. Colley's men had not dug in. There were no trenches, no proper breastworks, no cohesive firing line along the rim, just loose picket positions scattered around the saucer-shaped summit, many of the soldiers lying down out of sight of the edge, believing the position essentially unassailable. Colley himself reportedly went to rest in a tent near the center of the plateau. Down below, panic gave way almost immediately to something more dangerous: calculation. Joubert convened a hurried council of war. Some commandants argued for immediate retreat. The position looked hopeless, the hill impossibly steep, British riflemen visible along its rim. Nicolas Smith argued the opposite. He'd looked at that same slope through different eyes: dead ground, ravines, boulder fields, and scattered scrub running almost the entire way up, cover enough for men who knew how to use it. He asked for volunteers. Roughly 150 Boers stepped forward, farmers, teenagers, a handful of veterans, organized into 3 loose storming parties under Smith, Joubert, and a field cornet named Stephanus Roos, along with Danny Mallon and Ferreira among the named leaders of the assault groups. No parade formation. No drill. Just men who understood exactly how to move from rock to rock, firing and advancing, covering each other in short, disciplined rushes, a technique they'd learned hunting, not soldiering. They started climbing around 7:30 a.m. What followed was nearly 5 hours of the single most lopsided marksmanship duel of the entire war. The Boers advanced in short bounds, using every fold in the ground, firing accurately at any British head or shoulder that showed above the crest, then moving before return fire could find them. British soldiers along the rim, most of them in exposed positions with poor fields of fire and almost no cover, began falling in 2s and 3s. Officers tried to organize volleys against an enemy that refused to present itself as a target. One junior officer on the summit that day, a 28-year-old lieutenant named Ian Hamilton, yes, the same Ian Hamilton who would command the doomed Gallipoli landings 34 years later, was shot through the wrist trying to rally the crumbling line, one of the few British officers on the hill who seemed to grasp, in real time, exactly how badly this was going. By late morning the Boer storming parties had reached dead ground just below the rim itself, close enough now that the climb became the fight. Smith's men crested the edge of the plateau in a final rush a little after midday. Then came the moment that decided everything. The British line broke. Not gradually. Not in good order. It simply came apart. Men abandoning positions, falling back across open ground with nowhere to go, Bur riflemen now firing down into a mass of retreating soldiers from the high rim they'd just captured. Collie, roused from his tent, tried to rally a line near the center of the plateau. He was shot in the head and killed almost instantly, one of the first general officers of the British Army to die in action in decades. No cover, no orders, no line, just men running, and men who knew exactly how to make them pay for it. 90 minutes. That was all it took to lose the hill Collie had spent 5 hours and an entire night climbing to take. The numbers, when the smoke cleared, told the story on their own. Of roughly 405 British troops engaged, casualties totaled around 285, 92 killed, including Collie himself, 134 wounded, and 59 taken prisoner. The Boer storming force of about 150 men suffered 1 killed and 5 wounded. 1 killed. 9 to 2 dead on the other side. A ratio close to 20 to 1. The ripples from Majuba spread far beyond a single hilltop. William Gladstone's government in London, already uneasy about the political and financial cost of the war, used the defeat as the final push toward a negotiated peace rather than escalation. The Pretoria Convention, signed in August 1881, restored self-government to the Transvaal under a loose British suzerainty, effectively handing the Boers the independence they'd fought for, on the back of a single catastrophic morning. For the first time in living memory, an African settler militia with no standing army, no artillery to speak of, and no formal military training had defeated a British imperial force decisively enough to end a war on its own terms. It would not be the last time. 18 years later, when the much larger Second Boer War broke out in 1899, Remember Majuba became a rallying cry on the British side. A wound the Empire nursed for 2 decades and eventually avenged, at a cost of tens of thousands of lives and a level of brutality, including the concentration camp system, that would leave its own permanent scar on the Empire's reputation. Majuba didn't destroy Britain in any literal sense. But it cracked something. It proved, publicly and humiliatingly, that the myth of imperial invincibility could be broken by a hillside full of farmers with rifles. And empires, once that illusion cracks, rarely put it fully back together. George Pomeroy Collie died on the summit, shot through the head, the most senior British officer killed in action in years. A career built on unbroken success ending in the one battle historians still cite as a textbook case of overconfidence. Piet Joubert went on to command Boer forces again in the far larger Second Boer War of 1899, rising to Commandant General of the entire Republic, though age and caution slowed him by then. He died of illness in 1900, having lived just long enough to see the Empire come back for its rematch. Nicolaes Smit, the quiet farmer who planned and led the winning assault, became a senior Transvaal statesman and eventually vice president of the South African Republic, dying in 1896, 3 years before the war he helped provoke, the second one, began. Ian Hamilton, wounded and humbled on Majuba as a young lieutenant, survived, rose steadily through the ranks, and by 1915 commanded the entire Allied expedition at Gallipoli, another campaign defined by high ground held by an enemy nobody had taken seriously enough, another defeat that stripped away imperial confidence in real time. He seems to have learned the wrong lesson, or perhaps the right one arrived too late to matter. An empire that had spent a century teaching the world to fear its uniforms spent one February morning learning, from a hillside of farmers, exactly how fragile that fear had always been. Today, Majuba Hill is a quiet nature reserve in KwaZulu-Natal, grazing land and hiking trails where the loudest sound most mornings is wind through the grass, no trace left of the 5 hours in 1881 when it was the most dangerous piece of ground in the British Empire. If this kind of granular, no-nonsense military history is your thing, subscribe and hit like. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. And I want to know what you think in the comments. Was Collie's night march up Majuba a defensible gamble that just went wrong? Or was it doomed the moment he assumed farmers couldn't fight like soldiers?